Welcome to our afternoon webinar at the Arizona Trauma Institute. My name is Crystal and I am going to be teaching today on resilience and parenting. So I just want to cover a couple housekeeping things really quick before we get into this. Let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. First though, if you do have any questions throughout this next hour and a half, you can ask those questions on the chat that's up on your screen. If you have any problems asking questions on the chat, you can go ahead and email them to Molly at the Arizona Trauma Institute. So my name again is Crystal, and I work at an agency in Arizona with children who have gone through trauma. And one of the things that I've learned as I've worked is how important the parenting role is in children's lives. I originally started my studies out in marriage and family therapy and just really had a heart for families. But as I've gone through this work, it really has solidified the importance of the role of the caregiver in a child's life. And so my hope today is to better equip you with the know-how to be the support for your parents or for your children in that parenting role. My own story in that has been that about 5 years ago, when I was in grad school, I went through a trauma class and learned a lot about resilience and what happens in the body when we become dysregulated. And at the end of it, Dr. Roten, who was my professor at the time, challenged all of us to go the next year and really pay attention to our systems and what happens in our systems and to watch how our relationships change. And so I'm always one that's up for a good challenge. And so I'm like, I'll try this out. And so for the next year, I really worked on building that capacity for resilience in my own life and parenting. And I just saw such drastic changes in how I parented my children, even in relationships with my husband, and how I handle relationships at work. And so my hope is that as we go throughout this next hour and a half, I can challenge you as you learn some of these things to utilize that in your own life, to watch as you learn to build some of this skill, how it changes your relationships with your kids and how it changes parenting, okay? If you, again, have any questions along the way, don't hesitate to ask. I don't have all of the answers, and so if there is a question that I'm not able to answer, please don't hesitate to email me, and I will reach out to Molly at the Arizona Trauma Institute, and I'll do my best to find an answer for you, okay? All right, so let's take a look at what resilience is. We, as a culture, have thought of resilience as just our ability to bounce back. When adversity happens, we can bounce back from that. In fact, the Webster's Dictionary defines it as an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. But I want to take a little bit of a different stance on what resilience is. Eric Greitens, in his book Resiliency, defines resilience as a virtue that enables people to move through hardship and to become better. And so there are things that happen in our lives that we're not going to just bounce back from. In fact, when we go through adversity, we don't bounce back, they change us. And we become resilient and we have the capacity for resiliency when we move through those hardships and we become better, we become stronger, we become wiser through those hardships. And so when we look at what is resilience today, well, resilience is our capacity to move through difficult situations and to grow from that. With our children, what happens in life is raising kids can be really frustrating at times, and so we get caught in the grind of things, and we get frustrated, and we start snapping, and eventually we find ourselves way off in left field asking ourselves, like, this is not the parent that I saw myself as. How did I get here? And so when we take a look at resilience in that, we can say, but I have the capacity to bring myself back, and I have the capacity to hold to those values that I want to be as a parent, okay? So what are just some of the common parental stressors? Homework time tends to be a huge stressor for parents. Juggling work and kids, just going through the grind of life, picking up kids, getting home, doing homework. A lot of times people bring work home with them. Bedtime routines can be frustrating. Kids getting in fights and arguing with one another. Having kids and keeping the house clean and tidy, especially for those of us who like everything nice and tidy. And then even to acknowledge that with each stage of life, there are stressors of having kids. I asked someone one time when my children were in their toddler years, I said, does this get easier? Please tell me this gets easier as they get older. And she paused for a second and she took a deep breath and she says, no, it doesn't get easier. It moves from physical exhaustion to emotional exhaustion. And I have found that to be oh so true, that with every stage of raising our children, there are a lot of challenges. There's the challenges of keeping up with toddlers and them getting into everything. There's the challenges of elementary age kids having homework and being curious. And then we enter the teen years, and there are a plethora of the challenges there as well. And then just the logistics of raising a family in the Western culture today. Parents work, kids usually have extracurricular activities, there's homework, there's planning for dinner, still trying to maintain some sort of family time. And so we just end up running around and trying to figure out how all of the pieces of life are going to work together. So these parental stressors are just a few of these. Just a few stressors. I think each of you could probably list 50 more stressors that you have as parents, and we still wouldn't cover them all. So I actually want you to take a minute, and I want you to jot down what your 3 top biggest stressors are. I'm going to give you just a minute to go ahead and think through those. So for some of you, you might have been able to say, oh, I know exactly what my top 3 are. And for others of you, you might have said, which 3 am I going to pick? But I have no doubt that you each will have been able to pick 3 stressors. So when we think of parental capacity, as long as we believe that the things that you wrote down are the cause of your stress, you'll always have the effects of stress. As long as we say homework is my stress, then that homework's not ever going to go away. As long as we say, well, my kids arguing makes me stressed out, well, our kids are going to argue. That's part of being kids. And so we will always maintain a level of stress as long as we believe that the stress comes from external, outside of us. And so when we can understand what stress truly is, when we can begin to move beyond that. So let's define stress for a second. What is stress? Stress is just simply our body's response to external stimulus. That's all it is. My body is now responding to something outside of me. So as long as we say, my kids make me stressed because they're arguing, or homework makes me stressed, then we're saying there is this external thing that has so much force over me that I can't control it. But when we're able to say, this is really just how my body is responding to what's going on, now we have the capacity to say, but it's my body and I can create change in that. One of the things that I personally have found as stressful, and I know that I'm not the only parent out there with this, is loading the dishwasher. The thought of my children loading the dishwasher, I can feel my core just tighten. I don't like it when my kids load the dishwasher. That I feel stress when that happens. And that stress response is this response that I have right here within my core. That has nothing to do with the dishwasher, and that has nothing to do with my kids loading the dishwasher. That has to do with the way that my body is perceiving what's happening outside in the external world, okay? The interesting thing is I've talked with lots of parents before, and apparently the dishwasher seems to be a common one, because as soon as I say kids loading the dishwasher, most parents are like, but the reason we know that it's just a response to external stimulus is that, why is it that one stressor is stressful for a parent, and yet we can have the same exact stressor and the other parent doesn't feel stressed at all? That's because their bodies are responding very differently. For whatever reason, for one parent, this perceived to me is a stressor, but for this parent, it's not. It's because of how our body is perceiving and responding to that external stimulus, okay? So let's take a look at how the body detects stress. All right, this is the hand model of the brain. And so I'm actually going to have you all follow along with me. So go ahead and hold your hand up like this. And you're going to tuck your thumb in over your hand and put your fingers over the rest of your thumb. So this is going to be your brain for about the next 5 to 10 minutes. I won't make you hold it up the whole time, so don't worry. All right, so this part right here, this is what we're going to consider as our brain stem. Okay, you can go ahead and put your brain stem down, your whole brain. Don't put just your brain stem, put your whole brain down. Our brain stem is responsible for all of the things that we do that we don't have to think about. It's responsible for automatic functions: breathing, pumping blood, digesting food, my mouth staying wet, my eyes staying moist. It's actually also the automatic response of our fight, flight, and freeze. So many of you have probably heard that before. Could you imagine if we had to live and think through all of those things? Pump blood, digest food, don't forget to breathe, that's important too. So luckily we have our brain stem, and that's actually one of the first things to develop in utero, because it's what gets the whole system flowing. All right, go ahead and hold your brains back up. All right, we're going to do a little bit of brain dissection today, so go ahead and open up your brain. Right inside here, right, this little area, the rest of our thumb, the scientific name for it is it's our limbic system. We're going to go ahead and just call that our emotion center because it's much simpler. All right, you can put your brains down now. So in our emotion center, that's where our emotions come from, but primarily our fear response, okay? But inside of our emotion center, there's this little almond-shaped thing. Again, the scientific name for it is our amygdala, but it is easily remembered as our smoke detector. It lets us know when there's a threat about. So our smoke detector will go off and it'll say threat, threat, threat. So there's a couple of things that are really important to know about our smoke detector. So if you're a note taker, now would be the time to write these things down because they're very, very important. The first thing to know about our smoke detector is it does not tell the difference between an emotional or a physical threat. So back in the day when we all lived in villages and lions would roam through our villages, our smoke detector was really important because our smoke detector would say, there's a lion in the village, threat. Today we don't have lions that roam through our cities and our villages, but we do have a lot of emotional threats. In fact, we live in a more peaceful time on our planet than we have in a very, very long time. So the majority of our threat is emotional. We don't generally have risks of starvation, or like running out of food here in the Western culture. We don't have risks of lions, but again, the majority is the emotional threat. So I have the threat of getting in an argument with my husband. I have the threat of my boss calling me into their office and getting in trouble. I have the threat of my kids arguing with each other. All of those are emotional threats. So our brain can't tell the difference between the two. So let's say, for example, that I live in a village and a lion goes roaming about in my village. Okay? What happens in my brain is my smoke detector goes off. It says threat, threat, threat. It sends a fear response to my emotion center, which signals to my brainstem, and my brainstem causes me to fight, flight, or freeze. So if I flight, that means I'm running away. If I fight, that means I'm going to go get my spears. And if I freeze, I'm just going to freeze up like this and hope that the lion doesn't doesn't attack me or bother me, okay? When it's an emotional threat, though, let's say that my kids are arguing. What happens is my smoke detector goes off. It says, threat, threat, threat. It sends a fear response to my emotion center, which signals to my brainstem, fight, flight, or freeze. So if I fight, what's that going to look like? I'm going to be yelling at my kids. If I flight, I might not run out of the house and run down the street, but I might walk away and leave the room. I'll feel so overwhelmed I can't handle it. And if I freeze, I'm going to get all caught up in my words, and my words aren't going to be able to come out. I'll be like, For those of you who are kind of brain nerds like me, in our brain there's this little area called the Broca's area, and that's where our words come from. And when we go in a freeze response, that area actually shuts off. And so we literally have no words, okay? The second thing to remember about our smoke detector is that it doesn't tell the difference between a real and perceived threat. So a lion in my village, that's a real threat. That's a true threat. Perceived threat is more in the eye of the beholder, and that is based largely off of past experiences and associations. Our brain learns largely off of association, which is very important because it keeps our brain from having to process new information all the time. And so if I see a chair, every time I see a chair, I don't have to say, what is that odd-looking thing? My brain pulls up instantaneously within milliseconds, almost like this Rolodex of responses of all these other experiences I've had with chairs. So just like this, I'll know what that is, and I'll know what it's for. Well, our brain does that with a lot of associations. So let's say, for example, that I was physically abused as a child, and the house that I grew up in, I lived there most of my life, and I grow up, and I'm like, I'm out of here, and I move out. A few years later, my family moves out, and let's say 20 years later, I decide to go back to that home to visit it. But I know it's going to be a very emotional experience for me, and so I decide to bring my friend with me. When we go into that house, my smoke detector is going to say, threat, threat, threat. Will my friend have the same experience? No, because her brain hasn't associated that house with all of those experiences. To her, that home isn't a threat, okay? So whether it's a real threat, a true threat, a lion in our village truly puts us at risk, or a perceived threat that's based off of past experiences, then our smoke detector is going to go off, okay? All right, so hold your brains back up. We're going to go ahead and close them. This part right here, where our fingers are, we're going to call that our wise brain, okay? You can go ahead and put your brains down. Our wise brain, sometimes it's referred to as our thoughtful brain, sometimes it's referred to as our executive functions, and our wise brain is very, very important. In our wise brain, we can make intentional responses. We are able to self-reflect and improve and grow. We can make good judgment calls. We have more logic. We have more empathy. So we can understand why people feel the way they do. And it's also where we understand right from wrong. So our moral awareness. Our wise brain helps us to think to the future, and it helps us to understand cause and effect, okay? So all of these come from that top function of our brain, which is our neocortex, would be the scientific name for that. So what happens when there's a threat, again, whether it's emotional, physical, real, or perceived, is we have our smoke detector goes off, gives a fear response to our emotion center, signals to our brainstem, fight, flight, or freeze, and when that happens, our wise brain shuts off. There's little to no neurological connection with our wise brain, which means we're not making intentional responses. We're not thinking what the best judgment call is. We're not thinking of cause and effect or how the other person in the situation feels. And we're not thinking if what we're doing is right or wrong. So I'm sure if I asked most of you and you were honest with yourselves and I said, have any of you ever gotten into an argument and you said something that you later regretted? I have been in that situation before. And I think we all can understand that. Well, what happens is when we get into that argument, our wise brain shuts off. So again, we're not thinking about, in that moment when I say those words, how is that going to affect the relationship with this person? How is this going to make them feel? So I'm having no empathy. What's this going to mean for the future of our relationship? Forward thinking. And it definitely isn't an intentional response, and we're not thinking about whether that response is right or wrong. So that wise brain function completely shuts off. So let's look at this in terms of our children. So we have our smoke detector, and our smoke detector is going to perceive a lot of threats that are threats to us. Remember the dishwasher example? My brain has perceived that as a threat. So what happens is my smoke detector goes, threat, threat, threat. And it sends a response to my emotion center, which then is going to cause my brainstem to react. Okay? Now, when I have the capacity for resilience, when I have the capacity to maintain my body's regulation, I can take a deep breath and I can respond intentionally to my kids. It's okay for them to load the dishwasher. They're going to learn. It's not a big deal. We'll have other opportunities to load the dishwasher. This is a teaching opportunity. Those are all great logic, judgment, intentional responses. But when that wise brain shuts off because we have that threat, when there's no or minimal neurological connection with that wise brain, then we're going to be yelling, we're going to be snappy and irritable. Okay? That has nothing to do with the dishwasher. That has everything to do with how we're perceiving the situation and whether or not we can keep that wise brain online. So when we want to build the capacity for intention and for resilience in parenting, really one of our biggest goals is to try and keep that wise brain back online. Okay? So there's one other system that I want to talk to you about, and that's our anterior cingulate of the cortex. This is our relevancy system. This is our system that says what in the environment is relevant and what's not. So with our ACC, the more it's used, the faster it becomes. It no longer cares about categories of things. It collapses those categories. It hyper-focuses on what it says is relevant. Okay? So I have this funny story. My family and I traveled to Louisiana, I think, last year. And we're walking down by this little river. And my daughter's walking next to me, and I saw a snake. And I mean, this thing, it was a black snake. It was like this thick, and I ran so fast. I'm like, ah! And my husband, he comes running after me. He's like, what happened? What happened? What happened? I'm like, there was a snake, and it was huge, and it was black, and I saw it, and it was going to eat me and the kids. And my husband, who's kind of like this cool-mannered guy, he comes up to me, and he's like, all right, well, let's go find the snake. So I'm like a little hesitant, and he follows after him, and we're looking for the snake, and we're looking for it. And when we found the snake, and it was a brown snake that was about this big. But my ACC hyper-focused on it and created it. It catastrophized it to this huge black snake that I was convinced was going to eat me and the kids up alive. Because that was the only relevant thing at the time. Like, I got hyper-focused on the snake. Okay? Our ACC also focuses on the external. This isn't the place where we're like, what's happening within me today? This is where we get that phrase, you make me feel this way. You make me respond this way. As parents, we say, well, you make me mad. You made me do this. The ACC says it's only the external world that's relevant. Okay? And the ACC also tends to be self-focused. And it's in this system, when this system is active, that we lose the integrity to be our best selves. Okay? We talked a little bit about what happens with associations, and the ACC is also based off of our own history. It is our threat response, our smoke detector, when our ACC is active, is bigger. And it causes us to become reactive. Like when I saw that snake, I wasn't going to sit there and say, I wonder what that was. I should go explore it. My ACC says that is extremely relevant and you need to get away from that big thing. It catastrophized the situation because my body said you need to stay safe. You need to keep your kids safe. And then it makes us hard to evaluate ourselves accurately. And so it's hard for us to sit and reflect on what our responsibility is in the situation, okay? And so when our ACC becomes active, we can't really put things into perspective, okay? So now that we have an understanding of what happens neurologically, what happens in our brains, when we go into a stress response, when we become stressed, we understand that all of those important thoughtful functions turn off. Let's look at the different ways that we respond to that. I do want to say one more thing about, I'm going to go back here just for a second. I do want to say one more thing about our hand model of the brain. The reason why it's so important that our wise brain shuts off is because when there is a true risk, a true threat, we don't want that to be on. So if I am living in a village and a lion comes into my village, I don't want to say, I wonder what my best response is right now. I wonder if it would be better to go get my spear or to try and run away. Maybe I should consult with some of my other village people. Maybe I should sit and do some mindfulness and reflect right now and meditate on the best response. We don't want to have that response. We don't have time to have that response. But again, because our brain doesn't tell the difference between an emotional or a physical threat, things that we don't really need to be reactive about, our brain still becomes reactive, and that's with the way we move out of that is when we can remain intentional in our responses, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So let's look at the three types of responses that people have in order to stay safe, or it's just the three types of main responses that we have. So I almost inevitably always have people who are kind of nerdy like me, so I'm going to give you the scientific name for these, but I put some pretty easy ways to remember those up as well. So the first way that we respond is in a balanced response. The scientific name for our balanced response would be our ventral vagal complex. Very long words, but it's just how we stay balanced. In our balanced response, our face is largely impacted by this area. And the reason why it's impacted, and I don't know if you've ever considered this before, but our facial response, what happens on our face is really for other people, not for ourselves. So if I come in from work one day and I've got my angry mom eyebrows going on, what that signals to everybody around me is mom's mad, so stay away. If I look really sad and kind of hunched over, I might have tears coming down my face. What that responds to people is she's feeling sad, she needs some comfort. If I'm happy and goofy and joyful, what that says is she's welcoming right now. You can come to her. So let's take that and place that for our kids. When our kids are feeling upset, that facial response is so that we know how to respond to them. If they're angry, what it says is their system's running really hot and they need someone to help them cool down. I've been here before, and so I don't place any judgment, but I always find it interesting when or at the grocery store and you've got the 2-year-old on the ground throwing the fit and the parent over them saying, stop it, you stop it right now. Because children actually don't have the ability to regulate their own emotions until they're about 12 years old. And so when you have the 2-year-old throwing a fit on the floor, they don't need someone to tell them stop it. We don't need to throw an adult fit back at them. What they need is someone to help them cool off. Okay? But we can't do that if we're not in our own balanced response. If our kids are crying, what that means is I need someone to have empathy and understanding and warmth for me. If our kids are happy, that means that I need someone to come share this moment for me. But in our balance system, our face will show to people what we need. Okay? In our balance system, we can maintain a warmth look for our children. Our second response is what would be a forceful response. This is, the scientific name for this would be our sympathetic nervous system. This is where we become very aggressive and hostile with our children. The part of our body that impacts this area is largely our chest and our chest area. So our heart rate becomes short and rapid, our breathing becomes short and shallow, quick and shallow. And the purpose of this system is to prepare us for a fight or flight response. We're getting ready to run or we're getting ready to fight. So in today, when we have an emotional threat, what that means is I'm getting ready to walk out the room because I feel so mad, or I'm getting ready to yell and scream. Okay? And so this is often the response that with our kids, when they do something, we respond, we react in a way that we later regret. Oh man, I shouldn't have said that to my kids. Okay? Our third system is our passive response. The name for this is our dorsal vagal system. And our passive response actually largely impacts the digestive area. This is our freeze response. When we think of a survival standpoint, the digestion is a really long process, and so when we're feeling a large amount of stress, the digestive area begins to shut down. Okay? And so in this response, we begin to withdraw, we begin to isolate. This one's actually more tricky. In working with parents, what I have found is that parents usually when they think of going into like a survival mode or a stress mode, they're like, oh, I'm totally calm with my kids. Like when they say stuff, I just get really quiet and withdraw. I'm like, that's still a survival response. We just don't usually think of it. Just because you're not yelling at your kids doesn't mean that you're not in the balanced response, okay? Because withdrawing and completely shutting down can actually be equally harmful in the relationship because our kids need us to stay warm and engaged with them. What we know with these three responses is that after about 30 to 60 days in children, that balanced response, let me back up. After 30 to 60 days, kids that don't have someone respond to their balanced response and are severely neglected will actually lose their facial expressions. So through studying Romanian orphanages, after 30 to 60 days, those babies stopped crying, and when an adult came to them, they would look away. In working with children, kids that have been through a significant amount of abuse or neglect have very flat affects. They don't show a whole lot of emotion because their brain has deemed that as not a helpful way to have your needs met. If I show people I cry, they don't come to me with warmth. They come to me with hurt, or they don't come to me at all. And so the brain says this isn't an effective way to get your needs met, so it's going to move on to other ways. I have worked with kids and adults as well who have a very flat affect. And that basically means it's kind of like a monotone emotion on your face all the time. And so when we're in that balanced response, it's important that we are allowing our kids to know what we're feeling through our facial response so that we can have reciprocity in that relationship. But it's equally important that we are tuning into our kids so that we know what's going on for them and how to meet those needs. So if we were to look at this in more of a graph, our forceful response is when we're hyper-aroused, and our passive response is when we're hypo-aroused. And what we want to be is right there in the middle in that optimal arousal zone. And when we're in that balanced response, this is where we gain the capacity for resiliency. In this system, we can solve problems, we have a flexible way of thinking, we can have warmth and understanding for our children. There's all of these great things that help us to get there, but as long as we're in the forceful system or our passive response, we become flexible, we become reactive, we become withdrawn. Parents even, I'm going to go a little technical for a second, but in the hypoarousal, in that passive response, parents can even begin to dissociate. Dissociate is basically that mind-body disconnect. So this is when you're kind of off in your own world, doing your own tasks all the time, not present with your kids, spacing out. Dissociation falls on this continuum of I space out and I feel like there's multiple of me or that I'm just not connected with my body. What we see in the passive response with parenting oftentimes is over on this end. Getting spacey is actually good for our brains every once in a while, but when we're at home with our kids and our kids need us present, kind of being off in our own world all the time isn't helpful. And so we want to make sure that if we find that we're becoming forceful, aggressive, hostile with our kids, we understand that that's not a system that's going to be helpful to that relationship. That's not going to help us build capacity. Conversely, if we're withdrawn, if we're kind of spacey, disconnected from our kids, that's not a helpful system either. We want to be right there in that balance zone, and that's where we get the capacity for resilience. So when our systems aren't integrating well, we aren't flexible, which means we can't see multiple solutions. This one's tricky because when we're in either of those survival systems, the forceful or the passive, it's hard to self-reflect in those systems. And so I've worked with parents who are like, I'm very flexible. My child just has to do things this exact way. But when we can stay in the optimal zone, we are able to really consider multiple options. I have a daughter. When she started middle school, she got a lot of anxiety about getting at attention. And so my response to her was, well, go get at attention. If you have anxiety about getting at attention, just go get one so you can see what it's like. And I was like, don't be disrespectful, like don't talk back to your teacher or something like that, but be late to school or class 3 times so that you get your detention and just get it over with. So that's that flexibility. We put our kids like in these boxes and they can only behave and do things a certain way, but when we can open our minds, there's so many different options. Another example that I use with my kids is we've taught our kids what compromises are. So if my husband or I say, hey, this is the way it's going to be, we're completely okay with our kids coming up to us and saying, can we make a compromise? And we're willing to consider what their compromise is because we want to have flexibility in thinking of solutions, and we want to teach them that flexibility in thinking of solutions. There is not just one way to do things. There are multiple ways. But when we go into that forceful or passive system, we can only see one way. That ACC, it hyper-focuses and says, this is the only way it can be done. Okay? It creates difficulties in relating with our children. We start viewing our kids as the problem. We start viewing our children as the thing that's causing us stress. We no longer can see what's causing them to feel upset or see their own dysregulation. It becomes about us. Again, I mentioned this earlier. The ACC is very self-centered. It only looks at me and how I feel. But when our brain isn't integrating well, we can't take a step back and say, gosh, my kid's really frustrated right now. What they need is me to help cool them off. When our brain isn't integrated well, it oftentimes feels disorganized and chaotic. And then finally, we just have difficulty tuning into ourselves. We have difficulty knowing where we're feeling dysregulated. We have difficulty knowing or thinking of how we would want to respond to a situation, what would be holding to our best selves. So let's look at some of the common responses that we see in our forceful response, our forceful system. So we see blaming. You make me yell, you make me feel this way, you make me stressed out. I wouldn't have to ground you to your room if you didn't do that. I wouldn't have to do this. Remember, again, that's in our forceful system or our passive system. We're not looking at the what's happening internally for us. We're only looking at the external. Everything else is everybody's fault. There's an author by the name of Brene Brown, and she has a great video on YouTube, but she talks about how blaming is just the discharging of discomfort and pain. And so when we go into that blame mode, that's just us taking our own internal discomfort and discharging it onto our children, which is not helpful for the relationship. We also see a lot of criticism. So you just don't put in any effort. This is your fault. You shouldn't have done this. When we get into that criticism mode, we're not looking at the flexibility in the situation. We're not looking for the strengths in the other person. We can't put that into perspective. Again, there's another author by the name of John Gottman, and he talks about how criticism is one of the most damaging things in relationships. And so when we criticize, what our hope is that the person will hear what we're saying and say, I really want to change right now. But rarely, if ever, does that happen. Usually when we criticize that other person's system saying, threat, 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 and they're not going to sit and self-reflect on that criticism. We also become rigid. Usually when we begin with the always and nevers, that's an indicator that we're in rigidity. And when we go into that rigidity, that's when we know that we are in that forceful or passive response. We have exaggerated consequences. So this is when we feel really, really mad or really, really stressed out. And we're like, you're losing your phone for 3 years. You're grounded for the rest of your life. When we go into those exaggerated consequences, again, a good indicator that we're in that forceful response. Yelling would be a forceful response. Complaining. When we start using swear words with our children, those are usually when we're like, oh, I wish I didn't say that. Especially when your kids start swearing and you're like, wonder where they learned that from. But that's a reactive response. That's that thing where that wise brain has shut off and now we're just reacting and not intentional in our responses. My guess is for most all parents, we want to uphold the integrity of our best selves, our best parenting selves. But when we go into that reactive response, we're not intentional anymore. Threatening, we've talked a little bit about that. And then the abrupt limit setting. So stop it, no, don't do that. Those would be another of our forceful responses. In our passive responses, this is where we'll see nagging. I've told you 10 times. Next time, I've already asked you 15 times, and when we really have asked 15 times. We begin to dissociate, so we've talked a little bit about that, but we can't hear our child's attempt to engage us because we are in that spaciness. One day I was when I drive, that's kind of my time to space out. I don't like people to talk to me when I drive. I just like to be in my own world. So I'm driving and I can kind of hear the kids in the background, but I'm not paying attention. Just kind of off in my own world, and all of a sudden I hear one of my kids say, Mommy can't hear you right now because she's spacing out. And so when we're doing that all of the time, we can't be present for our kids. Again, we all space out occasionally, but when it is constantly, we're not able to be there for our children. We can't hear their attempt to get us to engage with them. We begin shutting down, so we might become silent, we might become withdrawn. Again, a lot of people don't, a lot of parents haven't really seen this as a threat response in the past, as an unhealthy way or a not helpful way of parenting. They say, because we usually think of ineffective parenting as the forceful response. And so parents are like, well, I never yell at my kids. But when we're shutting down and becoming silent, that is an indicator that we're in a response that's not really helpful to relationship, okay? If we roll our eyes, that's a very passive response. I do find this funny because I have worked with a lot of parents who are like, my teenager just rolls their eyes all the time as the parent's rolling their eyes. But again, when you're in that passive response, you can't accurately reflect. You can't accurately evaluate yourself. And then last, the lack of interest or enjoyment in children, just walking away without any warning, just being cold, having our own flat affect in regard to our children so they can't read what we need or what's going on for us. Not what we need, but how they might respond to us. They can't read what's happening in the relationship. That's what I'm trying to say. And then we have gestures that signal to defeat. So like, I'm done. Okay. But when we're in our balanced response, we are able to think through problems flexibly. We're willing to compromise. We're willing to look at multiple solutions. We're able to really listen and validate our children's thoughts and feelings. So when my kids are arguing and I can stay in my balanced response, then I'm able to come to them and say, all right, guys, let's take some deep breaths. Let me hear what's happening from both sides. Or I might, because I'm flexible and I can think of multiple solutions, I might say, hey, what do we need to do to solve this? I want each of you to give me an idea of how we can solve this argument, okay? And so I can listen to them. If I have a teenager who's rolling her eyes at me and yelling at me, I can take a deep breath and say, look, I get that you're angry right now. Help me understand why you're feeling so angry, okay? One time when one of my kids was younger, I think she was in about 3rd grade at the time, she was just like, came home and she was really disrespectful. And my husband and I, we don't tolerate disrespect. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen in our home because it happens all the time. But I went to do like the angry mom eyebrows and the pointing finger, and I'm like, all right, just cool down, Crystal, just cool down. And so instead of having a forceful response, I was able to keep myself balanced, and I said to her, I noticed that you're feeling more frustrated today. Can you tell me what's different today? And she said, I got a 40% on my test. And had I not been able to listen to her, I couldn't validate how disappointing that is. She didn't need me to say, you don't ever talk to me like that. That's disrespectful. What she needed to say was, we all get bad grades on tests sometimes, and it's really disappointing. I could hear her and I could validate her. We have the ability to see solutions. When we get caught in the other two systems, we really don't see any solutions. We have the ability for warmth and affection. I do want to take a minute here at this warmth and affection point and just talk for a minute about the 3 most important things that kids need. Kids need an emotionally available caregiver. They need consistency, and they need predictability. And when we can give our kids those 3 things, we are creating the capacity for resilience in our own kids. So when we're in this balanced system and we are able to listen and validate with warmth and affection, we're already providing them with the first and most important thing. We're able to evaluate our own response. And so maybe it's in the minute, maybe it's at the end of the evening. We can say, all right, what did I do really well as a parent today? And what can I continue to build on and improve on? It also gives us the ability to be the external regulator for our kids. So again, our kids can't regulate themselves emotionally until they're about 12 years old. And then they hit the adolescent age, and so they still need us to regulate them. And so we're able to be that external regulator for them. The brain isn't done developing until between the ages of 25 and 27 years old. which means that our kids need us to be their external brain until that point. But how can we be their external brain if our wise brain shut off? Because that wise brain functionings are the last things to develop in kids. And so if ours are shut off, we sure can't be that for our children. And then last, when we're in that balanced response, we feel relaxed, we feel calm in our bodies, and so we are able to have more enjoyment in our relationship. We can laugh and have fun. Okay? So, what is our first resiliency factor? Our first resilience factor is to have a relaxed body. Okay? And I'm going to begin to bring myself in. Okay? So when we feel hungry, what happens is our tummy rumbles, it might have a little bit of pain, or it has a sensation in there, and we begin to recognize what that feeling is, and it's our signal for, I need food. So that within about 1/20th of a second. What we want to do is we want to begin to slow that process down, okay? So I put up here, it's more like a stair-step process. So we start off in this calm state up here, and our heart starts beating faster, our chest might start tightening, we might start rolling our eyes or clenching our jaw, maybe our face becomes flush, and I put clenched our jaw twice. Maybe you double clench your jaw, you might start lecturing, you might start raising your voice, and then suddenly you're yelling, you're throwing harsh punishments, and you're swearing at your kids, okay? That harsh punishment and swearing at your kids, that wasn't the starting point. There was a bunch of things that happened way before we got there. So I told you at the beginning that when I took that, it was my last class in grad school with Dr. Roten, he really challenged us to begin to recognize what was going on in our bodies and begin to calm those areas down so that we could stay in a regulated state and watch how it changed our relationship with our kids. And so for probably the first 3 months, I didn't even try and stay regulated. I just paid attention to what was happening in my body. And what I found was that I clenched my fists and I bit my lip, and I would get tension right here. And I knew I had a bad day because I'd have teeth marks on the inside of my lip, because all day long I was just biting my lip and clenching my fists. And so once I had a good idea of that, I could begin to calm those areas of the body down, okay? When we're not able to slow that process down, then it's like a volcano. And in our culture, what we're taught is you feel a certain way, and so you create a reaction based off of that, and then we identify with that reaction. So I feel angry with my kid, so I yell at them, and at the end of the day, I feel guilt and shame as a parent. What we want to do is we want to interrupt this process. So we begin to recognize what's going on in the body, okay? I want you to take a minute. I'm going to give you a minute, and I want you just to jot down a few things that happen in your body as you go from cool to either your forceful or your passive system. So you might say to yourself, what's the first thing that happens to me when I begin to feel upset? It might be that you furrow your eyebrows. It might be that you're rolling your eyes. It might be that you're clenching your fists. You might feel a tension in your chest. So just write a few of those down in like first, second, third, fourth, and as far down as you can get it of what's going on in your body. So once you begin to recognize these things, just spend some time just identifying what happens in your body. Don't worry about cooling it down. Just stay focused on becoming aware of it. And the interesting thing is the more you become aware of a few things, the more and more you'll notice, and you'll begin to realize how kind and how naturally your body is resilient in letting you know what's happening. And I also think that I call it the sweet spot. There's a sweet spot for people where it's almost like the point of return. Once I've hit this point down the stair-step process, there's no going back. And so we want to try and cool those areas before we get to that sweet spot. So you may say, once I start lecturing, there's no turning back for me. Once I start lecturing, I'm straight down the low road. You might say, once that there's a swear word out of my mouth, that's it for me. And our goal is to begin to calm our body in the sweet spot before we hit that point where we just can't turn back, where the threat response is just consumed us full force. Okay. So for some people, they pick up on their body response within a few weeks. For some people, it takes a few months, and for other people, it takes a few years. There's no right or wrong response. And as we learn this, it's ongoing monitoring. I learned about self-regulation for the first time about 5 years ago, and there's still days where I yell at my kids and then I'm like, dang it. But it's this constant ongoing monitoring of becoming aware of what's happening in our bodies, okay? But once we begin to recognize those areas in our body, then we can begin to calm those areas down. We notice where the tension is, and we can begin to relax those areas. So I'm going to take you for a couple minutes just through a few breathing activities. Breathing is one of the best ways to bring ourselves into a regulated state. So we're going to just practice a few of these here to give you some tools. So you notice that your fists are getting clenched and your jaw's clenching like this, which is saying I'm having a body response to external stimulus. It doesn't have anything to do with the external stimulus. It's my body's response. You can begin to shake out those areas. When I very first learned this, I would stand there and I'd be like, because when we do that, we are just kind of validating for our body that we need to be in that response, okay? But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to count breathe. So I'm going to count to 5, and as I count to 5, breathe in. I'm going to count to 2, and on that 2 count, hold it. And then I'm going to count to 5 again, and on that count out, on that count down, you breathe out, okay? If your lungs fill up before I get to 5, that means the breath is too fast. Or if your lungs empty out before I get to 5, that means, again, the breath is coming out too fast, okay? So breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold it for 1, 2, and out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to do it one more time. I'm going to slow it down just a little. And you want to try and fill up your lungs all the way. Breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold it, 1, 2, and out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So when you find yourself going into an unbalanced place, you can do count breathing, where you can count in, hold it for a couple seconds, and that's actually going to calm your system back down to a regulated state. The second one is called belly breathing. We actually, as adults, get into a really bad habit of breathing out of our chest. The most effective breathing is done through our belly, which, if you've ever been around babies, where do babies breathe from? Their belly, because that's where we're supposed to breathe from. We just get into a bad habit. So what you're going to do is you're going to put one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly. And the goal with this is to keep your hand on your chest still and the hand on your belly moving up and down. And this is how you practice breathing through your belly. So you're going to breathe in and out. And in and out. and in and out. And we want to try and make the breaths very deep and very slow, okay? And then the last one that I'm going to show you today is what I call hum breathing. Have you ever gotten really frustrated and went, that's actually our body's natural way to regulate itself. So we have a nerve that goes from our brainstem. It's the longest nerve in our body. It's called our vagus nerve. It runs through our vocal cords, and it goes all the way down to our digestive area. And it connects to every major organ of our body. And our vagus nerve can assist us in self-regulating, especially when it's vibrating. So when we go like this, it runs through our vocal cords, and so when we do that, it vibrates that nerve, and it helps to soothe our body. Well, we can do that in a very intentional way to continue to help our body to regulate. So rather than going, we can go, So let's try that for a second. Take a deep breath in. And so we learn to, when we do that, that calms our system down as well. So those are 3 breathing techniques. We can also do what's called a tense and relax, where we work our way up through our body. So we're going to start with our feet. Tense your feet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and relax them. Move it up through your legs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, tense, and relax. 1, 2, 3, relax it deeper, deeper. And we can move that all the way up through our body. Another way is when we know what areas are feeling dysregulated, we can tense them and then relax them. So if I feel tension in my jaw, I'm going to bite, tense, 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 and then I'm going to shake it out. If it's in my fists, in my arms, I might tense, 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 and relax it out. Okay? With kids, and I think this is equally helpful for kids or adults, I oftentimes use an oximeter. They're one of those little things that nurses or doctors use that go on your finger that get your heart rate. Oximeters are really great. For people that are active and very in shape, once your heart rate hits 80 beats a minute, you begin to release cortisol. For people that aren't as in shape, once your heart rate hits 100, then you begin to release cortisol. That cortisol is our stress chemical, which is going to cause us to go into that. It releases when we're in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so we want to keep our heart rate nice and calm. So an oximeter can be really helpful to put on your finger to breathe to help your heart rate to go down so you'll know where you're at. And it can be helpful just when you're not in a dysregulated state, just to practice breathing to begin to lower your heart rate. Okay? From interdependency to independency, where we don't rely on anybody. Probably in the field that I'm in, one of the most prevalent things that I've seen is when I first meet with families, one of the questions I ask is, when you're having a rough day, who do you go to? And almost every family that comes in through my door says, we just rely on each other. But the longer I've raised children and the longer that I have been in this field, the more I have come to realize that it truly takes a village. It really takes a village. As human beings, we have limitations. We are not limitless creatures. And so as we raise families, we really need the help of community. There's an author, I think his name's Gordon Newfield, and Gabor Mate wrote a book called Hold On to Your Kids. It's an excellent book. And I believe it's from this book anyways. They speak about how we don't let our kids go out and play because we don't know our community. And so what we do is we keep our kids inside, and so they're not getting outside playtime even when when I was a kid, we got to go outside and climb trees, and my husband grew up in the South on a ton of uncleared land, and him and his brother would go outside and play for hours. But because we don't know our community, we keep our kids inside. And he says instead of keeping our kids inside because they really need to get outside and be playing, what we need to do is we need to get to know our community. We need to get to know our neighbors really well and begin to build that sense of community. And there are so many ways that we can build our community supports. Is there a faith group that you can get involved in? A lot of faith groups become like family to each other. Can you get to know your neighbors? Is there a community group or a community center that you can get involved in? But when we are having feelings of stress and we're having a hard time regulating, we need that support to come in and help us out. Maybe we need a minute as parents. Maybe we need just someone there for 5 minutes. Maybe we just need someone to chat with. Maybe we need a date night with our partner. But that community support is extremely important. I want you, just for a minute, just write down a few supports that you have. And if you can't think of any, write down a few ideas since you're all in your balance systems. Write down a few flexible options of ways that you could begin to build community. Does that mean getting involved in a community center? Does that mean getting involved in a faith group? Does that mean getting to know your neighbors? So just take a minute and just jot a few ideas down, or what your support is now. I will say that in my younger years of parenting, my husband and I try to do everything on our own, and we really, over the years, have learned the value of relying on family and friends and community supports. All right. Resiliency factor number 3 is self-care. This is taking care of ourselves. As parents, that's kind of like being on an airplane and the oxygen masks bounce down. And what does the flight attendant say? If you have a child with you, do you put the oxygen mask on your kids or on you first? You put the oxygen mask on yourselves, because if we're not breathing, we're not effective to our kids. And so as parents, it's really important to take care of ourselves. And what happens so often is oftentimes parents begin to parent out of guilt. I feel bad, I feel guilty. That's parenting out of our own body's response. It's the same way as out of parenting out of stress. That's our own body's response. And when we begin to parent out of guilt, we're not parenting out of what our child best needs. And what our child mostly needs is an oxygenated, I think I just made oxygenated. A parent that has oxygen. That's what I'm trying to say. They need a parent that has oxygen. And so, again, it's important that we know what we need to do to take care of ourselves. So, some parents like to go get massages or get their nails done. Some parents like to be outdoors. Some parents like to go on date night. Some parents like to have like a guy's night or a girl's night or whatever kind of night. Some parents like to just have time alone to read or listen to a book. There are so many ideas of things that we can do to take care of ourselves, and for every person, that's going to look different. It's important that we take time to rest. In our culture, we are very overworked, and we're busy all the time. In fact, busyness has almost become like a status symbol. We have to be busy. And so I encourage you to let rest and well-being become your status symbol. And so whatever that looks like for you is going to be different. But when we can take care of ourselves, we can continue to grow in our own identity as a parent. Okay? So as we continue to build, our identities, consider, what are the top 3 values that you have as parents? If you lived with the integrity of these values, what would your actions be? Would you change how you respond to your children now? I mentioned earlier that we live where we feel a certain way and then we react and then we base our identity off of that. And what we want to begin to do is begin to start forming our identity now. When we take care of ourselves, we have the capacity to form that identity. So as a parent, this is my identity. These are the values that I want to have as a parent. And when we have that identity, now we know how we will act versus react. And then we can have a feeling after that. And I might feel mad sometimes, but that's okay because I still know what my identity is. I might feel happy sometimes, and that's okay because I still know what my identity is. And we're going to build off of our responses off of that identity. And it's not very often that we actually stop and reflect on what are the values that I want to have as a parent. Or what are the values that you want your kids to have as adults? Do you want them to be honest? Do you want to have them to have integrity? Do you want them to be hardworking? And what will it take you now today to begin to build that in them when they're adults? And if you want your kids to be hardworking as an adult, lecturing them today isn't going to get them there. Okay? Being a forceful system or a passful system isn't going to get them to that point. Okay? So, take a minute and just write down 3 things that you can do to find enjoyment and rest. What are 3 things that you can do to take care of yourselves as a parent? I would even add to that, as you begin to understand your own body's response to dysregulation, as you begin to understand the importance of community and the importance of self-care, also write down a couple people that you can call to hold you accountable to that. Because without that accountability, we're much more likely to begin to drift. Okay? So what are the benefits? When we as parents can continue to grow, when we can hold to our values, when we can stay in a balanced system, what we build is a secure attachment for our children. Our children will learn that when things are tough, they can come to us, that we are a secure and safe person to come to. You can often see a secure attachment in young children and toddlers because they might meander off a little ways from one of their parents, but they're constantly looking back to make sure that their parent's there. And that says, I can trust that this parent's going to be here for me. One of the ways that we can tell that a teen has a secure attachment is when things get rough, they know that they can go to their parent. Their parent is warm and affectionate. Their parent listens and validates. And so they know that my parent is someone that I can come to. Okay? And again, in the book I mentioned earlier, Hold On to Your Kids, he talks a lot about that. When our kids are in those teen years, that's probably one of the most important times where we need to keep our kids close to us, especially in today's society, so that they know that if something's going on, we are that secure attachment for them. We also have a deepened relationship with our kids. When we're in that forceful system, there is discontent. When we're in that forceful system, it creates a gap between us and our kids. It creates distance. But when we can stay in a balanced system, we can have a deep and meaningful relationship with our kids. And then finally, it helps us to live in integrity to our own values. It helps us live in integrity to the values that we want our children to hold. Okay? So at the very end, I just have a few books that I mentioned here today and another book, Parenting from the Inside Out by Dan Siegel. But with our last 10 minutes, I was going to open it up to see if we had any questions. If we have a toddler that's going to bed and crying.
Yeah. Did they read it for 20 minutes? What do they do?
You know, that's interesting because that is, when I was first raising kids, that was kind of the rule of thumb that I learned is you let your kids cry for 20 minutes. You know, there is a fine balance between like you want your children to build capacity, but you don't want your kids to be in a panic state either. And so I'm not going to say that there's a right or wrong way for this. I think what's important here is that we're attuning to our kids and knowing what their needs are. It is not good for kids to be in a panic state. So if you have a toddler in their room crying profusely, we need to go in there and tend to them because that's a child that's really dysregulated. We want to help our kids build capacity for regulation, but they're not going to do that on their own. Okay.
What was the last breathing technique that you called? Someone said that they thought it was hum breathing.
Hum breathing, yeah. So hum breathing is where you take a deep breath in and you breathe out. There we go. Now what's interesting about that is you can actually move that vibration from your belly to your chest. So if you're at home, maybe you'll feel more comfortable doing this. But what you do is you raise the hum and lower it, and you can feel that movement going up and down. So, and when it's deeper, it's here in the belly, and when it's higher, it's up here in the chest. What we really want to do is we want to get that hum down here in the belly, because remember that belly breathing is the most effective. So when we can get that hum down here too, that's where it's going to be most effective. All right. Well, thank you all so very much for your time today, and I hope that you enjoyed this webinar on parental resilience.